Work no longer provides stability, jobs still exist, productivity still rises, employment still fills time. Stability is what was removed. That separation defines modern work, not the disappearance of jobs, not the collapse of employment, but the quiet detachment of security from labor.
Here we have 10 times the amount of robotics as compared to any of our other fulfillment centers. We can process your order 25% faster.
The system did not stop using work. It stopped relying on work to protect people. For most of the 20th century, this arrangement would have been unrecognizable. Work was not simply a way to earn income. It was the primary stabilizing mechanism of adult life. Employment determined where people lived, how they planned their futures, when they formed families, and what level of risk they could tolerate. A job was not merely a transaction, it was a long-term contract between the individual and the economic system. That contract did not promise wealth, it promised continuity. This distinction matters. The middle of the 20th century did not assume that work would make people rich. It assumed work would make life predictable. Income would arrive consistently. Benefits would exist by default. Planning would make sense. Failure would be survivable. Stability was not excess. It was the baseline condition required for participation. This expectation shaped everything. Education systems were designed around the assumption of long careers. Skills were taught with the expectation they would be used for decades. Employers invested in training because retention was assumed. Housing markets were structured around stable income streams that would persist long enough to justify long-term debt. Banks issued mortgages on the assumption that employment would continue uninterrupted. Insurance systems assumed consistent participation. Retirement systems assumed decades of uninterrupted contribution. None of this was ideological, it was architectural. The economic system required broad, stable participation to function. Growth depended on labor. Labor depended on continuity. Continuity depended on stability. If workers became unstable, consumption weakened. If consumption weakened, production slowed. If production slowed, profits declined. If profits declined, investment retreated. Stability was not a benefit layered on top of work. It was load-bearing infrastructure. As long as labor was essential to output, protecting it was rational. Long-term employment, predictable wages, benefits, and pensions were not moral concessions. They were risk management tools. They ensured that workers remained anchored, predictable, and productive over long horizons. Anchored workers sustained demand. Sustained demand stabilized growth. The system depended on that loop. When work was essential, stability had to follow it. For decades, this structure held. Productivity rose and wages followed closely enough to preserve continuity. Employment anchored life planning. Risk-taking was possible because failure did not imply immediate collapse. Long-term commitments made sense because continuity was assumed rather than hoped for. Then the dependency weakened. The separation between work and stability did not arrive through mass unemployment, automation panic, or visible collapse. In many periods, employment numbers appeared healthy. Jobs continued to exist. People remained busy. Output increased. Productivity climbed. The system did not stop using labor. It stopped needing labor to be stable. This shift began quietly, not as a rejection of workers, but as a consequence of changing production dynamics. Technological systems allowed fewer people to produce more value. Automation reduced the need for redundancy. Software coordinated activity at scale. Processes replaced supervision. Systems replaced judgment. At first, this appeared to strengthen labor. Higher productivity suggested higher wages. Efficiency implied shared gains. The promise of work as a stabilizing force seemed intact. But beneath the surface, the structure was changing. Once output could increase without proportional increases in labor, work lost its position as a constraint. Growth no longer depended on expanding or stabilizing the workforce. Stability stopped being required for performance. Labor remained useful but no longer foundational. This was the turning point. Work did not disappear. Its leverage did. When something stops being essential, systems stop protecting it. Markets reward flexibility. Firms that reduce fixed obligations outperform those that maintain them. Long-term commitments begin to look like liabilities rather than strengths. Stability attached to work became expensive. The response was not abrupt. It was incremental. Employment contracts shortened quietly. Guarantees weakened gradually. Benefits shifted structure rather than disappearing outright. Risk was pushed outward in small, survivable steps. None of this felt dramatic because employment itself remained intact. People were still working, Paychecks still arrived, schedules were still filled, titles still existed, but the function of work had changed. Work no longer anchored long-term planning. It no longer insulated people from volatility. It no longer guaranteed continuity. It became transactional rather than foundational. This distinction is critical. The disappearance of stability did not require the disappearance of jobs. In fact, preserving employment made the transition smoother. As long as people remained occupied, the system avoided visible rupture. Output continued. Consumption persisted. Growth metrics remained functional. The first signal was not unemployment, it was structure. Employment stopped behaving like a long-term relationship and began behaving like procurement. Labor was purchased in units, output was measured narrowly. Time was segmented. Risk was externalized. What had once been a mutual dependency became a transactional exchange. Historically, firms absorbed uncertainty. Seasonal demand shifts, market cycles, and downturns were managed internally. Stability. For workers stabilized organizations. Predictable labor produced predictable output. As competition intensified and markets accelerated, that structure became inefficient. Fixed labor costs reduced flexibility. Long-term obligations increased vulnerability. Stability, once protective, became restrictive, so the dependency inverted. The system did not ask whether workers deserved stability. It asked whether stability was necessary. Once the answer became no, the structure began to unwind. This did not happen through a single decision or policy. It happened through incentives. Firms that reduced long-term commitments performed better. Markets rewarded them. Others followed. Over time, the system selected for models that preserved output while minimizing obligation. The result was not collapse. It was optimization. Work continued to exist, but its role shifted. It stopped being the channel through which stability flowed. Employment still organized time, but it no longer organized futures. This is why the change was difficult to recognize. People continued doing what they had been taught. They worked consistently. They remained flexible. They updated skills. They stayed employable. They accepted transitions as normal. The rituals of work remained intact even as its function changed. Yet stability felt increasingly fragile. Long-term planning felt risky. Security felt conditional. Commitments felt heavier than before. The discomfort felt personal. It was not. It was structural. The system had quietly decoupled work from stability, and once that decoupling occurred, there was no reason for the system to reverse course. Productivity continued, growth persisted, markets functioned. The removal of stability did not damage performance, it improved flexibility. That outcome mattered. If removing stability had undermined output, the structure would have collapsed. It did not. The system proved it could function without protecting labor. Once that was demonstrated, the dependency was gone. At that moment, work stopped being infrastructure and became input. And once work became input, stability became optional. This is the condition that defines modern employment. Work remains visible, jobs remain plentiful, productivity remains high. But the stabilizing function that once justified long-term protection is no longer required. That realization sets the stage for everything that follows. Because once the system no longer needs work to provide stability, it begins reorganizing around that reality, not through ideology, not through intent, but through incentives that quietly select what survives. That reorganization is what comes next. Once work stopped being required to provide stability, the system began reorganizing itself around that fact, not deliberately, not ideologically, but mechanically. Economic systems do not preserve functions out of tradition. They preserve what they need. Everything else is reduced, substituted, or externalized. Stability tied to labor was one of those functions. The first mechanism was risk transfer. For most of the 20th century, firms absorbed uncertainty. Demand fluctuated. Markets cycled. Shocks occurred. Organizations internalized that volatility so output could remain predictable. Stability for workers was not generosity, it was insulation. Stable labor produced stable production. As markets accelerated and competition intensified, that insulation became costly. Fixed obligations reduced flexibility. Long-term guarantees constrained responsiveness. Firms that carried stability internally became less competitive than those that pushed uncertainty outward. So risk moved. Employment contracts shortened. Guaranteed hours softened. Benefits detached from tenure. Healthcare, retirement security, and income continuity shifted from institutional responsibility to individual management. Volatility that once lived inside firms migrated outward into households. From the system's perspective, this was an improvement. Organizations became leaner, markets became more responsive, output became more resilient, workers became buffers. Employment did not disappear, stability did. The second mechanism was measurement. As financial markets grew more influential, the definition of corporate success narrowed. Firms were no longer evaluated primarily by what they produced or how many people they employed. They were evaluated by margins, efficiency, and return on capital. Labor-heavy models appeared fragile. Asset-light models appeared scalable. Stability attached to labor did not appear on balance sheets. Efficiency did. Once valuation models stopped recognizing worker stability as value, firms stopped paying for it. Not out of hostility, but because the market no longer rewarded it. What markets penalize, firms remove. What markets reward, firms expand. Stability tied to employment became invisible. The third mechanism was fragmentation. Work stopped being organized around careers and began organizing around tasks. Roles were broken into projects. Projects were broken into deliverables. Deliverables were broken into transactions. This reduced dependency in both directions. If one worker left, output continued. If demand shifted, labor adjusted. If costs rose, commitments ended. Fragmented systems do not require stable participants. They require interchangeable ones. Continuity becomes unnecessary when replacement is trivial. Careers lost coherence. Progression became non-linear. Experience accumulated without compounding. Each role stood alone. People worked continuously, but nothing carried forward. The fourth mechanism was standardization. As work fragmented, it was also simplified. Processes were codified. Output was measured narrowly. Performance was abstracted from context. Standardized work does not benefit from stability. It benefits from compliance. Once tasks can be performed interchangeably, tenure loses value. Experience stops protecting workers. Skill depth matters, less than task execution. Stability becomes cost without return. The fifth mechanism was outsourcing and vendorization. Functions once performed internally were reclassified as services. Departments became vendors. Employees became contractors. Long-term relationships became renewable agreements. Outsourcing did not remove work. It removed responsibility. When work is externalized, stability is no longer the firm's concern. Output matters. Conditions do not. The system rewarded organizations that maintained productivity while shedding obligation. The sixth mechanism was benefit decoupling. Benefits were once inseparable from employment because employment was the stabilizing contract. As work became transactional, benefits followed. Healthcare eligibility became conditional. Retirement shifted from defined outcomes to defined contributions. Paid leave became discretionary. Training became optional. Employment persisted, but protection thinned. The worker still had a job. The job no longer behaved like infrastructure. The seventh mechanism was substitution. As stability weakened, the system substituted access for security. Credit replaced savings. Financing replaced ownership. Flexibility replaced permanence. Households continued participating economically even as protection eroded. Demand remained intact. The system continued functioning. Once participation without stability proved viable, the incentive to restore stability disappeared. The eighth mechanism was normalization. As instability spread, it stopped being treated as abnormal. Short tenure became expected. Job switching became standard. Risk became personal rather than systemic. Language adjusted. Flexibility became freedom. Risk became opportunity. Resilience became virtue. These were not ideological narratives. They were adaptive ones. Systems that externalize risk must normalize it to remain functional. Once expectations adjusted, resistance faded. Stability stopped being assumed. It became aspirational, optional, or irrelevant. The ninth mechanism was detachment. Once work stopped being the foundation of stability, the system detached emotionally as well as structurally. Employment became transactional. Output mattered. Long-term outcomes did not. Productivity gains no longer translated into security because there was no structural reason for them to do so. Stability was no longer required for performance. The system did not punish workers, it ignored them. Punishment implies intent. Indifference implies optimization. Once stability was no longer necessary, it was optimized away. This did not create chaos, it created equilibrium. Employment persists because tasks persist. Work persists because output persists. Stability does not persist because it is no longer required. From the system's perspective, the problem was solved. What followed was not collapse, but relocation. Stability did not disappear from the economy. It stopped flowing through labor. It began concentrating elsewhere, in places that do not require participation to function. That relocation is what reshaped everything outside the workplace, and it is where the final consequences emerge. Once stability stopped flowing through labor, it did not vanish from the system. It relocated. The economic system did not abandon security as a concept. It stopped distributing it through participation. Instead, stability began concentrating in places that did not require people to remain employed, productive, or even present. This distinction matters. The system did not become unstable. People did. Markets continued operating. Firms continued producing. Capital continued compounding. Output continued growing. Nothing essential to the system's function broke. Only the pathway through which individuals accessed stability changed. For most of the 20th century, stability flowed outward from work. Employment acted as the central distribution channel. Through it came income continuity, healthcare, housing access, retirement security, and social predictability. Stability arrived gradually but reliably through sustained participation. Once that channel was no longer required, the system rerouted stability elsewhere. It moved toward position. Position does not depend on effort. It does not require time. It does not require participation. Position compounds automatically. Ownership of assets, control of platforms, access to capital, proximity to scalable systems. These became the new anchors. This is why the system can generate extraordinary wealth alongside widespread insecurity without contradiction. Stability still exists. It is simply no longer attached to work. Those who hold positions within compounding structures remain insulated. Those who rely on labor remain exposed. This is not exclusion. It is detachment. The system did not push people out. It stopped protecting them. This relocation reshaped life timelines in subtle but profound ways. For most of modern history, adulthood followed a predictable arc. Education led to employment. Employment led to stability. Stability enabled long-term planning. Major decisions made sense because the future was legible. Once stability detached from work, that arc fractured. Early career no longer functioned as an on-ramp to security. Entry-level employment remained, but it no longer established continuity. The early years became provisional rather than foundational. People worked, but did not anchor. Mid-career no longer represented consolidation. Experience accumulated, but it did not reliably translate into insulation from risk. Employment existed, but volatility remained. Households remained exposed even after years of participation. Later career no longer guaranteed protection. Long tenure did not ensure security. Benefits were thinner. Retirement outcomes were uncertain. Continuity became conditional rather than assumed. This shift was not caused by individual choices. It was caused by structural reorganization. The system learned it could function without anchoring lives. Once that was proven, it stopped paying for anchors. This is why stability increasingly feels disconnected from effort. People can work consistently for decades and remain insecure. Others can remain loosely attached to work and remain stable. The difference is not productivity, it is leverage. Leverage compounds. Participation does not. Assets do not require renewal. Employment does. Assets scale passively. Labor scales linearly. Once the system reorganized around compounding structures, stability followed them. This is why ownership became the dividing line. Housing transformed from shelter into yield. Ownership ceased to function primarily as a lifestyle choice and became a stabilizing financial position. Rent flows provided predictability regardless of tenant stability. Appreciation rewarded scarcity rather than productivity. Those who owned housing became insulated from volatility. Those who did not absorbed it. Transportation followed the same logic. Ownership gave way to access. Leasing and subscription models preserved predictability for firms while shifting depreciation, maintenance, and replacement cycles outward. Software completed the transition. Ownership disappeared entirely. Tools became licenses. Licenses became subscriptions. Subscriptions became perpetual obligations. Capability was no longer possessed. It was rented. Entertainment followed. Media libraries vanished. Collections dissolved. Access replaced possession. Control remained centralized. In each case, the same pattern repeated. Ownership introduced finality, access preserved dependency. Dependency is more predictable than loyalty. Predictability is more valuable than participation. Once dependency is established, stability for the user is no longer required. The system remains functional as long as access continues. This explains why stability could be removed from work without destabilizing demand. Households adapted by absorbing risk privately. Debt replaced buffers. Credit replaced savings. Flexibility replaced permanence. The system did not need people to be secure. It needed them to remain enrolled. Once that distinction became clear, the structure stabilized. This produces a quiet psychological effect. Effort becomes maintenance rather than progress. Work becomes something to manage rather than rely on. Planning becomes provisional rather than confident. People do not rebel against this structure because it does not announce itself. It reveals itself gradually through lived experience. Expectations shrink, milestones delay, commitments narrow, risk tolerance declines. This adaptation is not ideological, it is survival. Over time, instability becomes normalized. Short tenure feels ordinary. Career changes feel expected. Insecurity feels personal rather than systemic. Language adapts to accommodate the new reality. Flexibility becomes freedom. Risk becomes opportunity. Resilience becomes virtue. These narratives do not create the system, they rationalize it. Systems that externalize risk must normalize it to remain stable. Once normalization sets in, resistance disappears. At that point, the equilibrium locks. Firms do not offer stability because workers no longer expect it. Workers do not expect it because firms no longer offer it. The system no longer faces pressure to restore what it no longer requires. This is why the separation between work and stability feels permanent. It is not a temporary imbalance. It is a completed transition. Employment persists because tasks persist. Work persists because output persists. But stability does not return because it is no longer structurally necessary. From the system's perspective, this outcome is optimal. It is more flexible, more scalable, more resilient. Volatility has been pushed outward. The system absorbs shocks without internal disruption. Economic growth can coexist with widespread insecurity without triggering correction because traditional feedback loops no longer apply. The system did not fail. It succeeded. It succeeded in removing dependencies that once constrained it. Human stability was one of them. This does not mean humans are obsolete. It means they are no longer foundational. There is a difference. The system still accommodates people. It simply does not require them to be secure. For younger generations, this reality does not feel like loss. It feels like baseline. They do not remember a time when work guaranteed continuity. They do not expect employment to anchor their lives. They plan cautiously, commit conditionally, and treat work as something to manage rather than trust. This is not pessimism. It is adaptation. A system that no longer guarantees stability does not produce idealism. It produces caution. Long-term commitments feel risky. Life planning feels provisional. Security feels conditional. People delay milestones not because they reject them, but because the structure no longer supports them. This quiet delay reshapes society without confrontation. The unsettling realization is not that work changed. It is that the change is complete. There is no return to a time when employment automatically provided continuity. That structure depended on conditions that no longer exist. Once systems learn they can function without certain guarantees, they do. Not reintroduce them voluntarily. Efficiency does not reverse itself. Work will not disappear. Jobs will continue. Productivity will rise. Markets will grow. But stability will remain separate. And that separation will define modern life. Nothing broke. The system evolved. Work still matters. It just no longer protects. And once that truth is understood clearly, it cannot be unseen. The system no longer requires stability from labor to function. It already moved on. For more content like this, like and subscribe.